session on waste and indeterminacy. I get to be first up today, so I'm going to be timing myself, but I do have someone who's keeping extra track of me at the back, so I will try not to use my privileges too overly much. So in this talk, I'm exploring the idea of fair trade, very provisionally used that term, and the notion of e-waste. This is a talk that's really 3 parts theory, 2 parts methods, and 1 part empirics. It's very much an ongoing project, so I need to just situate that project a little bit. So the research asks, what's the right thing to do with electronic waste? Where, how, and under what conditions should it be recycled? Then how might a better understanding of the knowledge, skills, and creativities of workers who operate in foreign markets but who rework and reimagine what we typically cast off as waste into valuable commodities potentially lead to a rethinking of electronic waste as a potential source of value? And then third, is a system of ethical or fair trade in e-waste, and to me that would include things like not just material and component recovery, but reuse, refurbishment, repair, etc. Is it a viable alternative to existing strategies like trade bans, which has been the typical mode of regulating e-waste? And even if it's viable, is it desirable? And even if it is viable, what would it look like? Since, as I'll talk a little bit more in a moment, fair trade, the research on fair trade is premised almost exclusively on agricultural products, crafts, that kind of thing, as opposed to recycling or electronics. So there are a couple of exceptions that I can talk more about if there are questions on that. So I should just say that, so anyone who's looking for deep and satisfying answers to those questions, I can guarantee you're going to be disappointed by my talk. Okay, the project. As I say, this is very much at the beginning or the first of at least 5 years of research, so there's still tons more to do. This is a little sort of, as it were, public outreach poster that I use to try and explain what we're doing. The same research questions I just talked about, and then a overview of the methods that we're using. A combination of community asset mapping, where we're working with repair, refurbishers, recyclers in foreign markets. A process called photo voice, which you may have heard of in other contexts, which is very much, both of these are very much an iterative process of meeting and consulting with actual or potential participants who then become or take on a role much more along the lines of being co-researchers as opposed to research subjects in the classical sense. And then doing very quantitative process audits of things like material flow balances of the materials they receive, the prices that they pay for them, the ways they process that material, and then where that material goes, and the prices they receive for those processed materials. So that's a very quick and dirty overview of the approach that I'm taking in this project. And I should say I'm working with a number of people, other professors, other students, and of course our co-researchers in each of these markets. So this really is a collective effort in that sense. If I have sort of 2 takeaway points that I might frame the rest of the presentation in, they're as follows. The first would be to say that discards connect us. Much as discards are riddings, where in some sense we might be thinking of creating separations, discards are also groupings. They're attachment sites. They're partial specific connections generated by ongoing action. Though partial and situated, they nevertheless raise these very fundamental moral and ethical questions. That's the first takeaway. The second is that in trying to come to grips with those sorts of issues, the moral and ethical issues, and provide rich answers to the research questions, I really find J.K. Gibson-Graham's language of economic diversity incredibly helpful. And much of what I'm going to talk about as I go along here is going to, I hope, demonstrate that. So let me just start with a couple of key caveats about my use of fair trade. Fair trade, for those in the room who already know the literature, will know it's a gigantic literature. It's still fairly new for me, and I just want to sort of highlight that I certainly am not understanding fair trade as a kind of universal panacea, or that it has always and everywhere achieves what it sets out to achieve. If we had to sort of pose key critical questions to the idea of fair trade, you know, we could talk about who has access to these markets for these products, the differential forms of power that exist even within fair trade networks, differences, for example, between owners or buyers in a fair trade commodity relationship, which may be quite different than the people who are actually out in the field picking, say, coffee or on a shop floor somewhere. And also pose some pretty pointed questions about the effects of fair trade, which are very mixed. Sometimes they're positives, very often they're minimal or even negative. So I'm using the idea of fair trade very provisionally here. We might also sort of add in some additional questions here, thinking about the politics involved, and maybe talk about a relationship or a tension between what we could call a politics of who is fair trade fair for, in other populations. Even if you, in the case of electronics recycling, made it toxicologically very clean, if you have incredibly intense work routines and all that kind of stuff, that doesn't mean that the work conditions are fair. They may be environmentally not benign, then relatively so, but the magnitude of work on a recycling line still may not be fair. We could complement that, I think, with Anne-Marie Moll's idea of a politics of what, and kind of, in a way, question the very notion of good that is in play in any notion of fairness or ethical trade. And that would be to change the question of who is the trade for to what are the goods that are being sought in the first place, and which bad's fought, and how is good set up as good in the first place. As abstract as that might sound, if we think with people like Zsa Gilles, those of you in the waste studies literature will know her work, who point out that, look, if we constantly focus on post-consumption recycling, we're never talking about how the stuff was made in the first place, right? So what is held up as good is, of course, not innocently so. So I suppose in thinking with the fair trade literature and then J.K. Gibson-Graham's work, there's this, in the project for me, this real tension between fair trade, which has its own labeling process and is in some ways very formalized, to something that we might call ethical exchange, which is not inherently capitalist, but also not inherently non-capitalist either. So that then takes me to situating the project a little bit more. So that image that I opened with about discards connecting this, I have to thank my former master's student, Chris McNabb, for pulling this circuit board out of this pile that you see in the background, which we found on a tour of a recycling facility who is now partnering with us in the project in a tiny, tiny little town called Fronteras, Mexico, just south of the Arizona border, about an hour's drive. It is a long and convoluted story about how it got started, only some of which I can tell today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it towards the end. These other two blue tags there I don't have time to talk about other than to say those represent the Canada mine, a major copper mine. Please ask me questions about that at the end if you would like to hear more. Okay. So thinking with J.K. Gibson-Graham and some people that they also draw on, Kalal and Lepawsky, if I'm saying that name properly. I've been thinking about the project that we're doing as a form of research in the wild. And what Kalal and Lepawsky mean by that in their paper is a distinction between what they call confined research, which is research in laboratories by sort of stereotypical scientists, and research by, in their case, patient groups who go out and do all kinds of research either on their own or lobbying for certain kinds of research programs that aren't necessarily funded. And Kalal's point is that it is both professional scientists and these patient groups use very similar techniques, so we should think of them in some sense as engaged in the same project. J.K. Gibson-Graham have cited Kalal and his work on research in the wild and offered up this idea of hybrid research collectives, where those involved in the research, some of whom are professional researchers by some measure, Professor Mailer, myself, a professional researcher in training here in Arroyo, a very talented PhD student working with me, and others, like members of the Retroworks New Mexico recycling facility, who in strict terms might not be professional researchers, but in engaging in the project are using practices that are completely recognizable as research techniques that we might learn and teach in a university setting. So J.K. Gibson-Graham tell us that we can start where we are. We can start at any site and at any scale, local or global, and begin to build community economies. And in a sense, the people in Retroworks, New Mexico have been already doing that long before any of us got entangled with them. So that is one reason that Gibson-Graham's work is helpful for me, at least, in thinking about this project. A very quick sort of overview of Retroworks New Mexico. They began as a cooperative in 2005 and became a legal cooperative in between June and August of that year. I don't think I have time to go through all of these details, but very early on, they got involved with Robin and Genthran, who is a recycler, owns his own recycling business in Vermont. Very convoluted story there. He is, in Retroworks New Mexico's documents, referred to as the main investor. And he is also a collaborator on this grant. They struggled for a number of years to get some pilot projects going. A sort of watershed was 2007, 2008, when they won a contract from the city of Tucson to recycle the city's electronic waste. They won that contract, but it was a contract that was subsequently revoked by the city in large part because of some opposition by an environmental NGO, so they didn't actually get to do the work in the end. That was a major blow, needless to say. And since that point, have been struggling to carry on. Currently, Retroworks New Mexico, which are referred to as RDM, they operate by processing material sent to them from the Vermont facility. They have developed their own international contracts in terms of processing material and sending it out for buyers, really in Asia mostly, also in the US. And they operate as a revenue loss to American Retroworks, which is the Vermont-based facility. So it is a somewhat convoluted relationship. But one of the things that is nice about Gibson-Graham's framework, I'm not going to go through this entire table, is that they offer up a way of being able to talk realistically about the kind of organization that RDM is. If you look at RDM, it is very explicitly engaged in trying to develop an ethical fair trade market for electronics recycling. It does involve itself in some local trading systems in the town of Frontier. People, on the other hand, who work in the recycling facility are wage labor, so they're, in that sense, back up into the capitalist enterprise. There are elements of green capitalism and social responsibility directly in the firm, as well as it being organized legally as a cooperative, but as we've learned through interviews, there's a great deal of internal politics in terms of who is actually in the cooperative and who is on the cooperative board of directors versus working on the shop floor and that kind of thing. So what this sort of point diagram is meant to suggest is that is this diverse shape of RDM. It's difficult to fit it into any particular category of alternative market, non-market capitalism. And J.K. Gibson-Graham's language really helps me open that up, which I find useful. How it may change in the future is really a totally open question, as it moves more towards a fair trade, potentially moves towards a fair trade model. Okay, just in the last few minutes, because I know I'm running very close to the time, I can give you a sense of the work that we've been doing with RDM. Basically, it has entailed several workshops where we began to start with some training around what would it even mean to do research together? What does research mean? These folks may have incredible skills in terms of recycling and being able to creatively rework things, and they certainly do. But the idea of doing research is not necessarily they've come in contact with. Some of the members were cowboys 3 months ago. Some have not finished even high school. Others, you'll see later, have professional training as nurses or financial accounting. So it's incredible things. I think we're not going to have time to do that. So let me just jump a little bit further forward. This is part of the community asset mapping process we were going through. This is just June, just passed. So we collected a variety of community asset mapping data through another workshop, but we're only just now starting to work our way through that. So this is why this talk is fairly provisional. But some of the things that members of RDM themselves identified in terms of the assets that they didn't necessarily recognize that they had prior to us doing the community asset mapping with them. So if we were to look at institutional and physical resources, things that they identified included the insurance system, the education system, etc. Then a whole gamut of individual resources, skills as painters, cowboying, baking bread, plumbing, reading, shorthand. If you're familiar with Gibson-Graham's work, you know this is exactly the kind of list of unacknowledged assets that can be sort of present in the community, and it's bringing them out through this sort of interactive process of working with groups on the ground that communities begin to realize what they may already have yet not have recognized. Field work in Frontieres, where members of RDM and ourselves created workbooks where we went out and mapped the actual physical presence of things like businesses. And then a process of creating a series of network maps showing, this is RDM here at the center, all of the businesses in Frontieres that it conducts business with, various county assets that it conducts businesses with, or has some form of relationship with. This was a very powerful process for members of RDM. They really did not, they told us, they did not realize, one, there were that many assets, as it were, in the community, or that they were connected to that many potential supports for their work. until they went through this process. So I'm just going to talk about issues, but anyway, last thing. The sort of most immediate outcome of that process was the RDM members wanting to create an orchard or a nursery to supply a restaurant that the co-op also already owns, but it has been sitting dormant for years, to produce locally grown food and organic food for that restaurant. I just want to emphasize here, we didn't take them to that desire. That was what they told us we want to do. So this is a very iterative and open process, and still very early. So start from where you are, get to where you go, and keep going. All right, I'm out of time. Thank you. We'll maybe save questions for me at the end of the session.